Hello and welcome. In this lecture video, I'll be talking about key cost terms and concepts in managerial accounting. A lot of the cost terms and concepts that I'm talking about right here, especially variable costs and fixed costs, and then also mixed costs as well, we will discuss several times throughout the rest of our discussions on managerial accounting. And we'll use our understanding of variable costs and fixed costs to help us make business decisions. So understanding variable costs and fixed costs and mixed costs and how they behave is really, really important. Okay. So let's take a look at some of these terms. So when we talk about variable costs, what we're talking about are those costs that increase or decrease in total with respect to the level of activity. So they increase or decrease in total with respect to the level of activity. They stay constant per unit of level of activity. So they stay constant per unit. So an example is if at a restaurant, if you've ever been a waiter or waitress, okay, that would be an example of a variable cost for a restaurant. Variable costs, VC, variable costs for a restaurant. Okay, so let's think about that. So from the restaurant's perspective, if it's a busy night and they have more customers, how many waiters and waitresses are they going to have? They're probably going to have more on a busy night because they have more customers than they would have on a slow night. Okay, so that's what I mean by the level of activity. The number of customers in the restaurant is really one aspect of the level of activity. And as the number of customers in the restaurant increases, the restaurant has to have more waiters and waitresses on staff for that night. As they have more waitresses and waiters on staff for that night, what happens to the cost of employing those waiters and waitresses for that night? Well, it's going to increase, right? Because you have more people on staff for that night. So your total cost that you have to pay out for that night, your total expenses, your being the restaurant, your total expenses will increase simply because you'll have more waiters and waitresses on staff for that night because you have more customers. Those waiters and waitresses will be working more hours to service the higher or the larger number of customers, right? So from the restaurant's perspective, as the number of customers increases, they have to bring on more waiters and waitresses to help those customers. That increases the number of hours that they have to pay the waiters and waitresses. So their total expenses increase as the number of customers, which then leads to the greater hours for waiters and waitresses, increases. So it increases or decreases in total with respect to the number of hours that they have to pay for the waiters and waitresses. And then that, of course, is dependent upon how many customers that they have for that night. But that doesn't change how much they pay them per hour. So they still pay them, I'm just pulling out a number here, $6 an hour. Okay, they still pay them a $6 an hour regardless if they work 10 hours or 20 hours or 30 hours. It still stays the same. So it stays constant per hour, but the restaurant's total waiter compensation for waiters and waitresses, those expenses increase with the number of hours, or they could also decrease with the total number of hours. But it stays constant per hour. Okay? So if you're confused about variable costs, just think about waiters and waitresses. Okay? It stays constant per hour, what we pay them, but because it could be a busy night and they have more customers. They may have to have more waiters and waitresses on staff for that night, which increases the number of hours that they have to pay for the waiters and waitresses, which then increases the total compensation expense for the waiters and waitresses. Right? The total wage expense for the waiters and waitresses. But that doesn't change how much they pay them per hour. Okay, so that's a good example of variable cost. Some other examples, we could say direct materials, and we'll talk more about that later on in another lecture video. Direct labor is another example, and then commissions are other examples of variable costs. Fixed costs, on the other hand, stay constant in total, and they decrease per unit as activity increases. They decrease per unit as the level of activity increases. Okay? Let's go back to the restaurant example. What's an example of a fixed cost? Rent. Right? If they have 100 customers or one customer, do they still pay the same amount of rent? Yes. It stays constant. Okay? But let's say that they have $100 in rent. And let's say that they have one customer. What is rent per customer? It's $100. What happens when they move from one customer to 100 customers? What happens to rent per customer? It decreases, right? I have one customer here, and then I move to 100 customers. My fixed costs, my rent, stay the same, so my numerator stays the same, but my denominator, which is the level of activity, that increases. So then what happens is this becomes $1 per customer. My fixed costs, my rent per unit, per customer, decreases from $100 to $100 as activity, the number of customers, increases. Okay? And another example of a fixed cost would be advertising. And then a final example would be depreciation. So rent, advertising, and depreciation are good examples of fixed costs. Mixed costs contain both a fixed and variable component. So mixed costs contain both a fixed and variable component. An example would be utilities. So if you think about utilities on a classroom building, so take a large building in which we teach classes, okay? If it's midnight in that building and there's no students in there, no faculty in there, do they still have to pay to heat the building or cool the building? Yeah. There still is utilities costs. So there's some bare minimum or fixed level of utilities costs, even if there's no one in the building. What happens, do you think, to utilities costs, though, as students come in, faculty come in, they turn on the lights, they turn on their computers, they turn on their projectors? What happens to utilities costs? It starts to increase. So there is some variable component to utilities costs that increase or decrease with the level or the number of people in the building. So as the number of people in the building increases, utilities costs could increase because they turn on the lights, they turn on the computers, they turn on the projectors. But even at midnight, when there's nobody in there, there's still some basic or fixed level of utilities costs. So utilities has a fixed and variable component. And we will talk more about utilities in our chapter covering cost, volume, profit analysis. Okay? Sunk costs. So I like to ask during class, how many students have ever been to a movie? In 5 minutes into the movie, you know it's terrible. A lot of people have been in that situation, right? But then I ask, how many people leave? And nobody does. And then I say, well, how many people stay? Most people raise their hand. And I say, well, why did you stay? Why do you stay in the movie, even though 5 minutes into the movie, you know it's going to be terrible? And then what they say is, well, I paid for the ticket. Well, let's think about that. If you leave the movie, did you pay for the ticket? Yeah. If you stay in the movie, did you pay for the ticket? Yes. So why does the ticket price matter? It doesn't. It doesn't matter. Okay, but a lot of people want to think it does. That's called the sunk cost fallacy. But what I'm telling you is that the price of that ticket that you paid for, if you can't get a refund, which is most of the time, right? You're not going to be able to get a refund. Even if you come and say, it's terrible, give me my money back. I've never tried that. I doubt it would work. And so I'm assuming you can't get a refund. So if you stay in the movie, you paid for the ticket. If you leave the movie, you paid for the ticket. That price of the ticket that you paid for, that is a sunk cost. Okay? It's a cost that occurred in the past and is not relevant to future decisions. Costs that occurred in the past and is not relevant to future decisions. That's a sunk cost. So think about the price of that ticket that you paid for to go into the movie. You can't get it back. Let's talk about opportunity costs. So opportunity costs are the benefits foregone from choosing one alternative over another. Okay? So, if we think back to that example with sunk costs that we talked about with our movie theater, so a lot of people want to focus on they want to stay in the movie because they paid for the ticket. And I'm telling you, you shouldn't think about it that way. You should think that, well, I paid for the ticket if I stayed or if I go, so it shouldn't matter. That price of the ticket, that's the sunk cost. What you should be focused on is on the opportunity cost. If that movie lasts another hour and a half and you're just going to stay in the movie and you know it's bad just because you want to mentally recoup the price of your ticket, what you're ignoring is the opportunity cost, and that's what you should be focused on. What you should focus on is what else could you do with your time rather than staying in a bad movie. You could be outside. You could be studying for your accounting exam. You could be watching informative lecture videos on managerial accounting. There's so many other things that you could be doing with your time rather than sitting in the movie theater and watching a bad movie. So you want to consider the opportunity cost. What else could you be doing with your time? And that's what we mean. The benefits foregone from choosing one alternative over another. There are always opportunity costs to every decision that you make. And opportunity costs are relevant. They do matter. Sunk costs should not matter. Let's talk about direct costs. So those are those costs that are easily traceable to a department, product, or service. Indirect costs, on the other hand, are not easily traceable to a department, product, or service. Okay? So when we talk about direct costs or indirect costs, we can think about it in terms of this building right over here. We have insurance on the bottling plant. We can directly trace that to that insurance is for this plant, but we can't directly trace that insurance cost to the products that we make. Okay? In the next lecture video, I'll continue this discussion. Thanks.